Part of the appeal of a video game is that you can get injured without getting injured. But that doesn't mean sometimes the injury isn't so realistic, you really just feel it. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 games with realistic injuries. Starting off with number 10, it's Kingdom Come Deliverance, a perfect game to start this list with, because compared to most games, it's pretty realistic anyways. Damage and injuries are just part of it. But that being said, it doesn't quite match up with everything else in this list. How this game works is that you got your standard health bar, you got your stamina bar, nothing special there, but certain parts of your body, they're prone to injury. If you get hit in the leg or just fall a long distance, your movement speed is going to get significantly reduced. Head injuries affect your vision, make the screen wobble. Torso damage affects stamina regeneration, that sort of thing. Take enough damage to your hand, for instance. You can't use two-handed weapons, which is a pretty severe punishment, honestly. Different weapons can cause different effects. Bladed weapons can cause bleeding, while blunt weapons can stun and cause trauma. There's a lot of different modifiers to damage, but actually healing this stuff, relatively basic. The only major thing you need to worry about in this game is bleeding. If you're bleeding, you're going to die pretty fast, so that's got to be bandaged as soon as you can. But everything else, it can be cured through potions or just sleeping it off. That restores your health, causes negative effects to go away. You don't have to use special treatments or anything like that. And in the way Kingdom Come is kind of one of the most forgiving healing systems out there. There's still a ton of realistic details, but you can cure a broken leg with a good night's sleep. So, I mean, you gotta weigh the realism versus the lack of it. Still, the fact that certain things do certain things specifically, it's good. It's a good idea. Even if not perfectly realistic on every single level, it still does things that are very realistic. And number 9 is Prey from 2017. On a normal playthrough, damage and healing in Prey is about as basic as any other game out there. You got a health bar, you got healing items, that's it. The option to use traumas can be selected at the start of the game, and they make the experience significantly more challenging though. So once it's activated, just remember you can't turn it off. With traumas active, instead of just taking straight damage, you get hit with negative status effects as well. So you take some blunt damage, you can get a concussion, that blurs your vision. It also affects resistance to psychic attacks. With traumas active, the entire typhoon now causes fear, which messes up your vision and lowers your accuracy. And it's funny, but you can cure it with alcohol. But then again, there's drunkenness, so there's a certain element of balance that you eventually have to figure out. You can also get burns, radiation sicknesses, hemorrhaging, fractures, the list goes on, and almost all of it requires certain pharmaceutical items to cure. Everything can be cured by a medical operator, but if one isn't available, you'll need specific items, like I said. There's coagulating gel for bleeding, there's antidote for poisoning, skin grafts for burns. None of this stuff is in the game normally, and with a limited inventory, having to worry about this stuff really changes the nature of the game. There's so much to the trauma system that it almost feels like a survival sim. The game already has a lot of sim elements, so all these injuries feel pretty natural to the experience, even if they're painfully annoying to deal with. And number 8 is Fear and Hunger. Most of the games on this list have complex injury systems to be more realistic, but with Fear and Hunger, a bizarre little indie RPG that's gotten a lot of notoriety recently, it's just kind of sadistic. It's a cruel, unforgiving, and often unpleasant game. At first glance, looks like an old school JRPG, in a lot of ways plays like one, but that's where the similarities end. In most RPGs, getting whacked by an enemy causes you to lose a few health points. Doesn't really register, but in Fear and Hunger, every hit counts. 1 or 2 strikes can be enough to kill your character outright, and if they survive, then you're probably bleeding, blind, or have a broken bone. That lowers your max HP, or something worse like an infection. If you got some herbs, infections are actually pretty easy to take care of, but if you don't, then the only way to avoid death is to get a bone saw and cut the infected limb off. That's not the only way to lose body parts either. You can get arms or legs chopped off in a battle, and the effect is basically exactly as devastating as you imagine. No legs means no walking, no arms means no weapons. There's certain rare magic that can heal you, but otherwise you're basically screwed. And that's what I'm talking about when I say this game is sadistic rather than realistic. Obviously it's possible to lose both arms and legs and still continue playing the game somehow. It's so over the top that it's hard to take seriously, but that's probably the point. And number 7 is Metal Gear Solid 3. You really can't talk about realistic injury systems without mentioning MGS3's cure menu. It's pretty abstract, but it does simulate the feeling of dealing with injuries better than almost any other game, even now. The thing that makes MGS3 stand out is how it emphasizes the survival elements. I mean, the game isn't just about sneaking around, you also gotta catch animals to eat and deal with injuries. Pretty much any damage you take has the potential to lead to some kind of other injury, and there's a unique way to cure it. If you break a leg, Snake slows down. If you use a splint and a bandage, the injury is quote-unquote cured. Burns need ointment. You get the sniffles, you gotta take cold medicine. You eat something rotten, you'll need digestive medicine. Those are the basics. As an example, dealing with something as basic as getting shot requires a knife to remove the bullet, and then you have to apply disinfectant to the wound. You have to use a septic to stop the bleeding. You got to use a suture kit to close the wound. Finally, a bandage. And all this doesn't cure you immediately. It does remove the negative effects of the injury and increases Snake's health regeneration. So it's not realistic in practice, but it does do a good job making you do things that you would need to do in order to survive here without bogging the gameplay down too much. The actual process of healing is more realistic than in most other games, but the injuries themselves are a little more forgiving compared to a lot of other games on this list. And number 6 is Green Hell. A lot of survival games include some kind of supernatural element, or like an enemy as your primary concern, but in Green Hell, the enemy is the jungle itself. Well, I mean, okay, there's natives that can be a problem, but when you're starting out, the real struggle is trying to survive in what is an incredibly dangerous environment. For most players starting out, their first experience is to wander around the woods, drink some water, get an infection, eat some random berries, get food poisoning, slip off a ledge, get a laceration, walk through water, get covered in leeches, get a fever, and die. Pretty much everything you can do in Green Hell can kill you in some way. It's one of the most unforgiving games ever when starting out. And once you get the hang of things, I guess you would say it gets easier, but I don't know. You're just kind of learning what does and doesn't kill you. Easy is maybe not the right word, but part of what makes the injuries so realistic in Green Hell is that you don't just get like a pop-up telling you what you have. You actually have to physically inspect your body for injuries, and they can be pretty nasty. First time I saw I had worms under my skin, nearly threw up. Absolutely disgusting. And number 5 is Project Zomboid. Almost everything in Project Zomboid is like this, but the health system is extremely granular. But although it's extremely in-depth, it's actually pretty simple to understand. Like, the game uses this Sims-like notification system called Moodles. It tells you in simple terms what negative effects your character's suffering, and what it actually does. And what makes it so realistic is a lot of these injuries are pretty complex to treat, and there's not like a few different classifications of them. There's just a large number of them. For example, breaking and climbing through a window causes you to get glass shards embedded in your hand, which could cause severe bleeding, pain. It's all got to be treated by removing the glass with tweezers, or your bare hands, I don't know. Then it has to be disinfected, stitched, and bandaged. In Zomboid, healing doesn't happen automatically either. It can take hours or even days to fully recover, and dirty bandages eventually have to be replaced with clean ones to avoid infection. One of the more interesting things about Zomboid is how you can use improvised items for healing. Like, there's bandages, but you can also rip up clothes and use those for bandages instead. A regular needle and thread can be used in place of a suture kit if you don't have any other option. It does obviously cause more pain when used, that sort of thing. None of this really actually matters if you get infected with a zombie virus, though, because no matter what, in 3 days you're dead. And number 4 is Bushido Blade. You know how most fighting games go, right? There's a health bar, you smack your opponent enough, and you win. Doesn't matter how deadly the weapons are, or if it's Mortal Kombat and it looks like you killed your opponent twice. You still gotta keep punching until it's done. There's a few games that break this trend, like that Deadliest Warrior game for the Xbox, but the best of this rare lot is probably Bushido Blade. It's from 1997, came from Square, doesn't have a life bar, has no timer, almost no UI during a fight, and it's because most of the time all it takes to end the match is a single hit. So the combat's a little more about careful positioning and timing rather than pure technical skill. Yeah, You don't always die from a single hit, but it's so deadly. Depending on where the weapon strikes and what kind of damage it does, your character might just be slowed down or fully crippled, which might force them to crawl. And like, yeah, you can continue the fight technically, but it's probably just your opponent toying with you at that point. The brutality of every match makes this a really tense fighting game that's actually really easy to get into because it's really interesting and different in a way that works, but it is super difficult to master. There have been a few games that have tried to do something similar, but I don't think anybody's really accomplished what Bushido Blade did. And number 3 is Kenshi, another game that prioritized because it's cruelty over realism. At least, I mean, it feels that way at first, because the game just brutalizes you at every available opportunity. Kenshi is one of those games that's almost impossible to describe. I guess it's basically a survival sandbox RPG, and when I say that, I kind of mean sort of. Doesn't really do justice to the relentless beating this game tries to give you. Depending on how you want to start anyways, there's a usual list of injuries you'd expect, like bleeding, lead damage, stomach injuries. Basically, if it's a bad thing that can happen, it's probably gonna happen to you in this game. Healing's relatively easy though. Just rest. There's also bandages. That's mostly what it boils down to, but the amount of damage you take also varies really wildly. Worst part is taking damage though, because if you take too much, you bleed out enough, you go into a recovery coma, and unless you have somebody to pick you up or fix you up, you're dead. Recovery coma only works when you're in a safe place. Just lying there though, bad enough, but the real problems come from one of the many roaming gangs of bandits finding you, knocking you out, and selling you into slavery. So then you're stuck toiling away in a mine as your injuries just get worse and worse. It's unforgiving, bordering on comedy. It can be really frustrating. But again, like a dark comedy, you can't really help but laugh at your little guy's endless suffering. And number 2 is RimWorld. If you're looking for a game with an absurdly detailed injury system, then they don't get much more complex than this. It's abstract as hell. All you're actually doing is seeing little pawns moving around, and it can be funny-ish. Weird, I guess is maybe the better word. But the underlying systems are super complex. Like, the simulation has 40 body parts alone, from the heart to the little toe, and each part has its own health value. Each one's logically connected to one another. Like the brain, for instance, lethal if destroyed. It affects a colonist's consciousness, sight processing, hearing, moving, and ability to work. So that's a lot. But the skull, guess what? Considered separate from the brain. It always takes damage if the brain does though, and damaging the skull causes significant pain. Organs can be destroyed, but to heal them you have to harvest and transplant a working organ. Basically the only way to fix certain injuries. It often means sacrificing a colonist to save another colonist. What makes RimWorld so unique is it's more of a big picture game. You're guiding your colonists and you want them to succeed, but the experience is more about generating interesting things and seeing what happens. There's an incredibly complex injury simulation running at all times, but it's not something you ever really need to think about all that much if you don't want to. For the people who really like to get deep in the weeds, there is a lot to appreciate, but you don't have to if you don't want to. It's still a fun game otherwise. And finally, at number 1, it's Escape from Tarkov. This one really gets into a bunch of lists, doesn't it? They really just don't get a lot more hardcore than Tarkov, do they? They being multiplayer shooters. It's super brutal, both competitively speaking, because players in this game just don't mess around, but also from a surprisingly realistic injury system. It's not as complex as something like RimWorld, but it does make up for its simplicity with immersion. There's only 7 major body parts to worry about: head, thorax, stomach, arms, and legs. Out of those, 2 are considered vital: the head and thorax. Lose all the health there and you're dead, which can often come from a single shot. Get hit in the arms, legs, and stomach, you can survive, but it's not pretty. If the health of a part goes to 0, you can't heal the normal way. You have to use a surgery kit, which only makes it possible to now heal the body part normally, meaning you use the surgery kit and then you use your normal healing stuff. There's a whole suite of injuries to worry about, mostly the sort of stuff you'd expect, but there are a few that add to the game's realism, like fresh wound that you get after a heavily bleeding wound. If you take damage damage or run too much while a wound is still considered fresh, it can open back up again and cause more bleeding. Another one is contusion, which is caused by a grenade exploding nearby or a bullet hitting a helmet. You may have avoided death with the helmet, but your hearing is going to be impaired for a while. And it's already a lot to think about, but the game has plans to go even further with these systems in the future and make them even more hardcore. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero. I'll see you next time right here on gameranx.